in states are safer. They have less contaminants. The labeling is better. They're being tested than products in those same states that are unregulated. So what some people call like the quote unquote black market. So I do think that there are certain safety guards. But, as we've seen in the state of California, where I think over half of the testing facilities were shut down by the California Department of Cannabis Control in the beginning of 2024, there's only so much that the states can do to enforce the testing practices and to ensure that the standardization is there and the labeling is there to be able to educate and protect consumers. We heard early on, I think from a caller, Amy, who was talking about her use of Delta-8 THC and how she felt comfortable with it because there wasn't so much THC in it. But, Delta-8 THC, which is generally not regulated, not tested for in most of the states, that acts like Delta-9 THC, that THC that people generally think is stronger than Delta-8 THC. And it's a good example of why we need better consumer education and better controls.
Well, Ziva Cooper, director of the UCLA Center for Cannabis and Cannabinoids. Professor Cooper, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Maya Salovitz, author of Undoing Drugs, The Untold Story of Harm Reduction and the Future of Addiction. Maya, thank you.
Thank you as well.
And by the way, speaking of consumers, when the new year arrives, we're going to be talking with On Point's money ladies, Michelle Singletary and Rana Faruhar. So if you have a question about the economy, whether it's the broad economy or your personal economy, let us know. Use the On Point Vox Pop app or call us at 617-353-0683. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from Storyworth. Each week, Storyworth emails a loved one a question about their life. After a year, they'll publish family memories into a bound book to keep forever. Learn more at Storyworth.com. And BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy and helping clients find balance. Clients are matched with one of 35,000 therapists for online therapy from anywhere at betterhelp.com/public.
You're listening to KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, and KQOW Bellingham, also available on the KUOW app. It's just about noon and time for KUOW's Week in Review. Here to give us a preview of today's show is your Week in Review host, Bill Radke.
Hello there. Lots to talk about today. A new police chief for Seattle. The mayor announced his choice this morning after firing the old police chief. An investigation concluded Adrian Diaz hired and supervised a romantic partner. Also this hour, what about a new wealth tax in Washington state? Our outgoing governor has proposed a tax that he says would apply to 3,400 Washingtonians, including Bill Gates. And what is the right response to the killing of a King County Metro bus driver? We'll cover the week's news. We'll ask what made our guests smile at the end of the show, and I hope you'll stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Chris Morgan, host of The Wild, a KUOW podcast about the wonders and resilience of nature and the people working to protect it. Through expert conversations and up-close encounters, we'll take you on a journey across the Pacific Northwest and around the world to explore some of our planet's most wild places, how they work, why they're so important, and what we can all do to preserve them. Listen to The Wild tonight at 8 or anytime on the KUOW app.
Support for KUOW comes from Premera Blue Cross, with a variety of health plans designed to fit both employee and business needs, including a provider network, mental health resources, and access to Kinwell primary care clinics. Learn more at business.premera.com.
The federal government is investing $7 billion in clean hydrogen. You can't just get it out of thin air, though.
Such a robust physical infrastructure, human infrastructure, and then all the know-how and safety and technical planning.
I'm Kai Rizdal. What you need to get more of element number one, that is next time on Marketplace.
Marketplace this afternoon at 2:30 and 6:30 here at 94.9 KUOW. We have expected high of 57 today. We're currently at 52. And then for the shortest day of the year tomorrow, dark, limited daylight, and rain. It's 12:01. This is KUOW.
Live from NPR News in New York City, I'm Doahlisa Kautal. The White House says federal agencies began notifying their employees of potential furloughs today in the event that the government shuts down. NPR's Deepa Shivaram reports Congress has until midnight to pass a funding deal.
Congress had reached a bipartisan deal to fund the government earlier this week, but then President-elect Donald Trump and his advisors weighed in and said they didn't approve of it. Yesterday, another proposal was put forward, but House Republicans were not able to pass that. Now, as some government employees are being informed that they would have to go without pay in the case that the government does shut down, the White House is blaming Republicans. Here's Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
Republicans blew up this deal. They did, and they need to fix this, period.
Jean-Pierre said there's still time for Congress to prevent a partial shutdown of the government, but the administration is trying to be prudent in their planning. Deepa Shivaram, NPR News, the White House.
The government's consumer financial watchdog is suing the payment network Zelle and three of the country's largest banks. As NPR's Laura Walmsley reports, the lawsuit alleges they failed to protect consumers from widespread fraud.
In the payment app Zelle's 7 years of existence, customers of Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, and Wells Fargo have lost more than $870 million due to a lack of fraud protections. That's according to the lawsuit from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau against those three banks, which are also among the co-owners of Zelle's parent company. The Bureau says the banks failed to implement effective safeguards, then failed to help customers who were defrauded. Here's CFPB Director Rohit Chopra.
These banks broke the law by running a payment system that made fraud easy and then refusing to help the victims.
In a statement, Zelle said the Bureau's lawsuit is legally and factually flawed and says its timing, quote, appears to be driven by political factors. Laurel Walmsley, NPR News.
Congestion pricing in New York City is set to go into effect the first week of January, but a preliminary injunction hearing is taking place at this hour, possibly putting a pause on the controversial tolling plan. Another holdup, the failed bargaining between neighboring New York and New Jersey. Governor Kathy Hochul accuses New Jersey officials of failing to negotiate in good faith.
You get stuck on New Jersey Transit, or waiting an hour in a PATH train, or you want a nice new bus station, this is going to all be affected if congestion pricing doesn't go through.
The daytime peak toll from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. Monday through Friday is $9 with an Easy Pass tag. A winter storm that dumped more than a half a foot of snow in parts of Minnesota caused more than 450 crashes there on Thursday. That's according to State Patrol. You're listening to NPR News from New York City.
This is KUOW News. I'm Kevin Kniested in Seattle. President-elect Donald Trump has said he doesn't necessarily plan to do away with the Affordable Care Act, still known to some as Obamacare, but Washington State's next insurance commissioner, Patty Kuderer, doesn't believe him. She thinks Trump will go back on his word.
Do you remember when he first came in 2016, he was going to repeal and replace Obamacare, right? I don't even think he knew what it was or how it functioned or how many people were impacted by it. And I don't think that this is any different. I don't view him as a very responsible human being. I think he is more of the destructive mode.
Kuderer says that if the incoming Trump administration does make cuts to the Affordable Care Act, she would support new state revenue streams like a wealth tax or closing tax exemptions to pay for state-funded health programs. Kuderer formally takes office next year. She'll be the first new insurance commissioner in more than 2 decades. The Seattle Times is reporting 2 cougars on the Olympic Peninsula have died of bird flu, and now there are concerns more cougars could be infected. Wildlife agents and a conservation group confirmed the deaths to the paper yesterday, saying both cats were young males and one was wearing a tracking collar. Officials think the cougars got sick after eating an infected animal. The H5N1 strain has been confirmed in other animals like skunks, bobcats, harbor seals, and raccoons here in Washington state. State Fish and Wildlife agents are asking the public to report sick or dead animals and to not touch them. And today is going to be one of the busiest days of the holiday travel season at SeaTac Airport. Approximately 172,000 people are expected to pass through the terminals today. The same is expected for tomorrow. So think about using the C-Spot Saver to help you get through those security checkpoints faster. You can also park in the garage for free for up to 90 minutes between 8 p.m. and midnight through December 27th. This is KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Fisher Investments. Fisher's dedicated team of specialists provide resources on investing, retirement income, estate planning, and more. Learn more at FisherInvestments.com. Investing in securities involves the risk of loss.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm your host, Bill Radke. Every week, here at the end of it, we get together and review what happened this week and what it might mean. And usually I say welcome back, like Patrick Malone. You're the Seattle Times senior investigative reporter. Welcome back to the show.
Happy to be back. Thanks, Bill.
Always happy to have you. Happy to see Saul Gamoran again, founder, president of Gamoran Legal Consulting. You were Nikki Haley's state campaign chair. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And then there's Ron. Ron Davis. I know you. Welcome to the show for the first time,
Thank you
Ron.
so much. Long-time listener,
Thank
first-time
you.
guest.
Thank you. I mostly know you because you ran for Seattle City Council last year. Will you
did.
tell us a little about yourself?
Yeah, I live in Northeast Seattle, and I am a consultant. I work with early-stage tech companies, helping them take products to market, enterprise products, and I also do some consulting in the political space as well. And I do have a newsletter that talks about Seattle politics and state politics. It's ronpdavis.substack.com. So.
Okay. Well, we're good to have you with us. We've got a lot to talk about this week. In fact, just as we're doing this show live on Friday, just a few hours ago, Seattle's mayor announced his choice for a new police chief. More on that in a moment, because we should say why Seattle needs a new police chief. The mayor just fired the old one. And why? Well, it's not just that he had an affair with a coworker.
But at SPD, you're not allowed to hire someone you're in a romantic relationship with without at least disclosing that conflict of interest first, especially if you're going to supervise that person.
That's KUOW's investigative reporter, Ashley Haruko. According to the city's investigation, Police Chief Adrian Diaz had a romantic relationship, went outside normal procedure to hire her as his chief of staff, told some colleagues about their sexual relationship in some detail, but denied the relationship to others. There was quite a rumor swirl, and Diaz denied this alleged affair even after KUOW reported on these rumors. Investigators say they found a birthday card / love note to Diaz in handwriting that they say matched his romantic partner, the former TV news anchor Jamie Tompkins, who investigators say falsified a handwriting sample in a failed attempt to hide her birthday card handiwork. My question to you, panel, is this just about the personal judgment of public officials in love, or is there a bigger issue here that would affect our listeners and the public?
Well, one issue that hasn't been touched on is that he hired her as chief of staff, though she had no experience. She was a TV news anchor.
Right. So
that leads credence to the idea that there was a romantic relationship. Why would he hire her for a position that she's not qualified for?
And does that say, is this just a little inside scandal and they're both now gone from the department and that's the end of it? Or do you think this says something about Seattle leadership, the mayor's choice of Adrian Diaz, Seattle SPD culture in general? Why should we care?
Well, go ahead, Ron.
All right, sure?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, I would say there's a pattern for sure, right? So while, it wasn't obviously great judgment in the end for Harold to hire Diaz, I think there's a pattern inside Seattle police of poor behavior and a lack of accountability for it, right? And it's created this hostile workplace. It's spun tons and tons of lawsuits. It certainly hasn't helped with our recruiting problems. And I think the one positive thing here is that in the end, accountability came for Mr. Diaz, but that sort of, to me, just highlights the contrast where Mayor Harrell and the council bargained away accountability in the latest contract. So we have no way to hold line officers accountable for this kind of behavior. And so it doesn't surprise me that we see that systemically. I'm sad to see it with the chief, but I'm at least glad that there was some accountability for him in the end.
Before we go, we're not today going to go deep into the accountability question, but for just to catch listeners up. This has been an ongoing issue. You know, Seattle has been under this consent decree for different problems with their policing, and one of the issues from the federal judge who's been overseeing this is he's been continually dissatisfied with how accountable Seattle police officers are for their actions, and he's continued to criticize those contract negotiations. Does that about cover it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I think
would say it does. I mean, we do keep seeing embarrassing exits for Seattle police chiefs, but it's also not unique to Seattle. I mean, we don't have to look any farther than Tacoma to see some really scandalous and even tragic endings to police chiefs' tenures that were failed to be held to account, for their actions. But I think it's more of a national question in the sense that this is a profession that gets a really long leash from society relative to most, even on issues such as when a human life is taken, right? So maybe there's a nexus between all that police get away with and all that they think they can get away with. So when we get specific about Diaz here, I think that we also need to look at the issue of deceit. I think one of the questions that is still sort of unanswered in all of this was he threw up a defense that said, I could not be involved in this relationship. I'm gay. And if he sincerely was struggling with the personal, decision to come out as gay, then certainly my heart goes out to him. But if, on the other hand, this investigation or the lawsuit that Chief Diaz has filed against the city end up showing that this was some sort of a shield he threw up that was not authentic, then I think that he owes an apology to the gay community and maybe the community as a whole, because Seattle's a place that embraces everyone's differences. And if that was something that he used to play on sympathies, I think that's another layer to this. And I don't know that we'll ever really know the answer, but I feel like the contradictions in the findings about the affair and what he had to say about his sexuality leave some unanswered questions about whether he was really trying to deceive the public and investigators here.
I want to say a little about that because I don't know everything that Adrian Diaz has said in every possible forum. I can't know. I listened to the interview that he did that seems to be the most referenced interview on the subject. He came out in a conversation with a conservative talk radio host, Jason Rantz, and they discussed this, but I thought that that Diaz was talking around the edges of it. The radio host asked him, would you have saved your job if you had come out earlier as gay? And he said, well, I think this is Diaz saying, I think it addresses a lot of concerns that people had. Then he says, but being a gay man doesn't mean you're a misogynist, because he's also been accused of sort of retaliation and sexism. There's a lot of lawsuits in the SPD. But he says, doesn't mean you're not a misogynist, but I know what I've done. I've always treated people well and respectfully. Later, he says, even if I came out earlier, I'd have been attacked some other way. If it wasn't this rumor, it would have been something else. But I did not hear him explicitly say, I'm gay and therefore I could not have had this inappropriate romantic relationship. That was my take. That, in fact, I don't know whether he's gone through with it, but his lawyers threatened to sue Publicola for their write-up of the description of that interview, where Publicola essentially said that was his defense. I'm gay, I couldn't have done this. And they said, he didn't say that. So that's a long-winded way of saying it. People can really parse their words in lots of different ways. I understand the supposition that, well, maybe this is a shield, as you put it. I just don't know.
I think maybe the bigger question for Seattle and its future and this pattern is, maybe what we need is a police chief to leave on normal terms, which is, I got a job somewhere else, I'm retiring, not going to work for Taser or Axon or whatever they call themselves these days. Because when you have a chaotic exit of a leader, it doesn't matter if it's a police department, a city, or a business, right? Chaotic exit of a leader usually leads to, a hair on fire situation where you're going for the first qualified person or remotely qualified person that you can get your hands on. And I think that sometimes then we're left with a lesser choice. I see that the chief from Madison, Wisconsin, who was hired today, was chosen from a pool of 44 that the committee viewed as qualified, right? So, I mean, that lends some confidence. You would hope that out of 44 candidates, this was the one we chose. But when chaos is why a chief leaves, it puts you on a bad footing for who comes next.
Well, now, since we've brought up the new, this is Harold's choice. This still has to be approved by the city council. But this is Sean Barnes, who is someone you may have seen in the news this week because he's the police chief in Madison, Wisconsin, where there was just a fatal school shooting. What I have a little bit that I've gleaned about Sean Barnes so far, but do you have any reaction to him or what you want from a new police chief?
You know, when I was reading some statements from him, the thing that I noticed that really jumped out to me is he was using some language like, you know, we need to be, I don't want to be tough on anything. I want to be smart about how we address crime. And I found that encouraging, but also a little bit surprising, just as somebody who ran for office last year and ran sort of on the other side of sort of where Harold and this council are at. And they ran against people like us saying words like that. So it was a little bit surprising. It feels like a little bit of a tone change, maybe a little more like Surar and a little less like Adrian Diaz. I mean, there's been some parsing of words all along, but I found that encouraging that he might be thinking a little bit less about sort of the theatrics of public safety and a little bit more about evidence-based practice.
I can say a little more about that. Surar, again, not everybody's up on this stuff. Yes. Surar was Shoreline's police chief, was the King County sheriff. She ran a state law enforcement training academy, and I've interviewed her. I think she's best known for, and I think this is what you're getting at, I think she's best known for training officers to go from being warriors to guardians. Remember, she's used that those words many times, and I did see the Seattle Times reported on the new police chief choice and said that characterized Sean Barnes as thinking that community policing should be driven by empirical evidence and not by outrage, prejudices, or emotion. I don't know how this rhetoric, where it overlaps, but if Surar, it was Surar and a former Kathleen O'Toole, a former Seattle police chief, were on this little committee to choose a police chief. When she names someone, I tend to think, as you do, Ron, that maybe this would nudge the Seattle Police Department in whatever a guardian culture instead of a warrior culture means to you. Any other reactions?
Well, just only that I think we won't really know until he gets here and starts doing the job. It's hard to assess on previous track records because this is a profession that wallpapers over mistakes sometimes, and the way that they relieve people of duties, it's often when they don't leave a paper trail of mistakes behind often because of strong union contracts and things. So, I think the default position should be give the man a chance, let him come in and see if he does a good job, and, but be open to all possibilities here, because until he really gets here and boots on the ground and sees the unique challenges that Seattle faces, the community's priorities, it's a little hard to judge, how well he's going to do.
Here's one item that I saw, again, this is in the Seattle Times story, said that Barnes is an advocate, has been a consistent advocate of public school resource officers, cops in schools. And that's been a controversy in Seattle, especially after we were sort of reconsidering policing after the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I did find a comment from, again, our interim police chief, Surar. She's doing the job. And she has also said that Seattle ought to consider putting officers back in schools. It's something she's advocated for in the past.
There was one camp that said if you have cops in schools, they're going to ignite the school to prison pipeline. And when we had that conversation, I was pretty angry because that's not how we were doing the school resource officer program in the King County Sheriff's Office. We did not put officers in schools to be quasi-security guards. They weren't the disciplinarians. They were placed in the school to develop relationships with kids, to develop trust, so they could prevent this kind of thing from happening.
So Seattle has had officers in schools in the past. Do you think that's where we're headed again? And any thoughts on that?
I hope so. I think that the path to prison is nonsense. And I think that having cops in schools, they develop relationships with the kids. I think Surar is 100% correct.
Why not? I mean, nonsense is strong. you understand that in some schools, the critics' experience has been that the cop, now it's just the cop is there to police the school, and it's not developing a good relationship between the kids and
Well, what examples of that do you have?
I have Susan Ferris's work around 2015 timeframe out of schools in Virginia that show when this went wrong. We worked together at the Center for Public Integrity, and I know her work very well. And I think what it shows is the extremes that this can get to when it goes off the rails, when it is not a guardian culture, when it is a warrior culture. That warrior mindset in there set a lot of kids with just marginal behavior problems on the road to criminal, charges, and often affected whether they were going to be able to continue through with education and things like this. It really was a pipeline to court. It was a default sort of knee-jerk reaction. And I think that's not to say that they all have to be that, right? That maybe there's a new path, and maybe it requires just a lens that's a little different, that's a little more protective. But
in fact, I just want to say this police chief choice said that he had been a history teacher, and he said that he came around to policing by having a great interaction with and experience with school resource officers.
Maybe it's training. Maybe they need to be better trained. But the concept of having police in schools, I think, is one that we should encourage and try to make work as opposed to, throw out.
And also, let's bear in mind that this is a chief who's coming from a community that, in a country that has the most outsized school shooting problem on the planet, is a city that has more school shootings in recent memory than most. So his perspectives on this probably they might be coming from the safety angle. I would like to know more about that because, his community has been affected in ways that Seattle is not. But juvenile justice has to be a big, neon question for the incoming chief, because there have been issues around whether juveniles' rights to an attorney might change here in the state and things like this, because juveniles have not been cooperative here in Seattle over a couple homicides that are well known on school grounds, right? So it's definitely a robust conversation that there's room for a lot of perspectives.
All right, do we cover it for now? Do you more to say, Ron?
I would just say I think the school to prison pipeline thing is pretty well documented in the research. I think Sue's point notwithstanding, there may be great counter examples, but I think we have said a lot in Seattle for a lot of years about we should train people different, we should change the culture. And once again, when you don't have a system of accountability in place, we've not been able to do that. So I don't know why we would expect that suddenly we would become standouts in this area. So I have a little bit of skepticism about it.
Well, we'll see whether whether Sean Barnes becomes the new police chief. In fact, the mayor's spokesperson said he's going to be at least interim police chief until the council approves him on an ongoing basis. And again, we couldn't meet the police chief from Madison today because I think he's pinned down dealing with this school shooting aftermath in Madison. So we'll have a chance to discuss all of this in 2025. This is our final show of the year, Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. We could get a new tax in Washington State, a wealth tax. I think it would be the first of its kind in the United States. We'll see. It's a proposal. We're going to take a short break and come and discuss that in just a moment.
Support for KUOW comes from the Port of Seattle. Upgrade SEA is working to renovate the port one project at a time to help make trips more streamlined and predictable, with construction underway reminding travelers to arrive early this holiday season. Current info is on the port's YouTube channel and at Fly SEA.
And from UW Medicine Heart Institute, offering personalized treatments for common to complex heart problems at multiple locations across the Puget Sound region. More at uwmedicine.org/heart. UW Medicine, a higher degree of healthcare.
Trying to get the latest scoop on Seattle? Then listen to Seattle Now, KUOW's signature news podcast. Every afternoon, we bring you the biggest headlines of the day, and we do it in less than 15 minutes. So check out Seattle Now on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts, and let's get caught up together.
This is KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke, and I'm here with my panel, Saul Gamoran, Patrick Malone, and Ron Davis, and we are now going to discuss the I don't know how big it is now, more than $10 billion budget shortfall, maybe much more, over the next 4 years that Washington State is facing. There was a proposal this week from the outgoing governor, Jay Inslee, a new tax on wealth.
So this tax would only be on the excess over $100 million.
Inslee says this tax would apply to about 3,400 Washington residents, including Bill Gates.
Over 4 years under this proposal, the wealth tax would generate about $10.3 billion.
Now, this is not up to Inslee, of course. It'll be between the legislature and the incoming governor, Bob Ferguson, who has said that he would not rule out tax increases, but that he would first scrub the budget for savings. So we can talk about why we had this budget in the first place. I'm curious to hear your first reactions to the idea of a tax on wealth, a tax on assets.
Well, I oppose it. I think number one, it's not fair. They've already been taxed. They've already paid their taxes on this money. And second thing is, I know there's you can look at lots of different studies this way and that way, but the bottom line is, I myself know people that are thinking about moving to different states without this fake income tax that we have, or so-called income tax that we have.
You're talking about the capital gains tax we currently have?
Yes.
Yeah.
But also this would just do it even more. And I just think it's just a classic soak the rich thing that I think covers over the problem of the deficit. I mean, the governor hired 8,000 new employees for the state government since COVID. And I think that, it's bloated. And I think that we can solve it without simply soaking the rich.
$10 billion of bloat?
I don't know if it's $10 billion of bloat, but I'd want to start there.
So I see it a little differently on a couple fronts. So first, I just say with the $10 billion, it's worth noting that that's a 4-year number, and if you look at the actual size of the budget, that's about 3.3 to 4.3% if it's 10 to 12 billion. So it is a large dollar number, but it would be easy to overstate. Like, whoops, we really screwed up when we're talking about a 3 or 4% variation. I think next, in terms of the wealth tax itself, wealth taxes are controversial in the tax literature, but there's a few things we do know. One is that tax differentials between different states have been studied over and over and over again, and we know that they do not have a net effect on migration of rich people, GDP growth, job creation, or startup formation. And these are studies out of like the Federal Reserve and MIT and Chicago and all that stuff. The one thing they affect is inequality. So I'm not as worried about that, especially given that we are 49th out of 50 when it comes to, the rich get off scot-free kind of deals, as in we have
a relatively regressive tax structure in Washington State.
Extremely.
I think we went from number 50 to number 49.
Right, with that capital gains tax. So I would say if given that the entire array of what the United States produces is not showing a migration effect, if we went from 49th to 45th, we're probably very much in the safe zone. And then I think it also addresses the fairness question that both the rich here are way, way, way less taxed than the poor relative to income, especially compared to other states. But also a lot of this income, or a lot of this money, is money that's grown through capital gain that won't be taxed because it will probably roll over at death. That is pretty typical when you started to get into the 100 millionaire, billionaire status, and then that gets to start over. You don't pay a capital gain on that. So I would actually argue that it's untaxed wealth anyway.
Well, I kind of look at it just more from the legislature's perspective, right? Because that's where my background is in covering these state houses and seeing the dynamics when taxes are proposed and stuff. So I think there is a chance these could pass. For one thing, there are a lot more constituents who are not billionaires that, somebody can send a mailer back home and get voted for again by saying, we spared you this and made billionaires pay their fair share. But by the same token, billionaires have a lot of clout. Probably, just to estimate it, like every billionaire has 1 million of us worth of clout, right? So it is going to be tough because they are deeply involved in the economy and things like this that matter to lawmakers. They want to keep things in balance. But the obvious reason for the deficit is that we don't have a state income tax. And I don't think there's an appetite for that in the legislature or in our neighborhoods, to be honest with you.
What about the reason for the deficit called spending?
Now, that part of it, and there are different ways to spend, right? So one thing that I've looked at occasionally around Washington State and have found sort of preternaturally opaque relative to other parts of the country is economic development incentives. So maybe one thing they want to look at is what they're getting for the tax giveaways they've already done. If they want to reassess that, that is one pool of money that they can go look at and say, something, maybe we're giving away the farm here, because it isn't just, robbing from Peter to pay Paul. It's robbing a bunch of little Peters, including people or entities that are designated taxing entities, whether it be for people with developmental disabilities. And so maybe it's worthwhile to go do a scrub on existing tax breaks, see if you can make up some of this from there. But, prioritizing necessary projects maybe, but, you're going to have a hard time if you want to cut programs and cut jobs. Those are hard sells, and that's why I think that this was a favor by Governor Inslee on his way out the door to Governor-elect Ferguson, that he didn't have to show up on the first day of work and say, I'm here to raise your taxes.
Saul's nodding his head.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. This was just a deal to help Governor-elect Ferguson, so it wasn't his idea. And he's going to scrub the budget first, and then, not surprisingly, he's going to support this idea of Governor Inslee. And he'll run with it. And every year it's going to get a little bigger.
Ron, I saw, again, Seattle Times noted social media posts by Seattle venture capitalist Nick Hanauer, who our listeners might know. He always tells me, I'm not a billionaire. I don't know if that's still true, but he's a something in air. And he has been one of those people who says, we need to tax rich folks like me. And he says the pitchforks will be coming out if we continue to have this unfair system. But even Nick Hanauer gets on social media and says, valuing private businesses and equity and artwork would be a logistical nightmare, probably wouldn't survive a ballot challenge. And even Nick Hanauer said every rich person I've spoken to in the last few days has said they will leave the state. And Ron, why wouldn't they rationally? Not everybody's going to leave the state. There's reasons you want to be in Washington state. But why wouldn't there be some amount of drain, as we just saw Jeff Bezos move to Florida so he could sell a bunch of stock?
Well, one is you could ask the same question about any tax on the wealthy, and somehow, some way, it's come out that there isn't a net drain, right? So to me, this is one of those places where we look at science rather than intuition. Or I have a lot of respect for Nick, but Nick talked to his friends and they're chatting about it, and that's definitely not the same. Mm-hmm. And then there are probably, so when I think about like what would be the sort of countervailing pushes, I generally think like places that invest in their workforce tend to be places where rich people get rich. Places like here in California and New York and all of that. And so they've been
California, a pretty high tax state, and still has Silicon Valley.
Yes, and they
but
are
it's
starting
being
to
drained. I mean, people are moving to Texas. They lost congressional seats. Tesla moved. I mean, they're feeling the pinch from this.
Yes, again, so this is I'm talking about net and net for tax gain. So one thing we can certainly say about California is there's particularly its housing costs are mismanaged, and this is generally what people cite when they leave. What I would, and of course that's not going to affect the billionaires. I think Nick's other point is actually probably his stronger point, which is about valuations of intangible assets. I actually once saw a really excellent counter to that, though, and it was in a letter to the editor in The Economist, and it was a Princeton professor saying it's actually quite simple. When someone values their Picasso, at $10 million, that should give in this case, it would be state treasury an option to purchase it at $10 million, and that ultimately you would land on a Pareto optimal level of valuations extremely quickly. And with only 3,400 families to try to do that with, and a small amount of enforcement, you could reach a settlement pretty quickly.
Any other reactions to outgoing Governor Inslee's wealth tax idea, or just to the fact that we have this, as Ron points out, not as big as it might sound, $10+ billion budget deficit over 4 years? We about covered it?
I did want to hit one other reason that we have the deficit.
Yeah.
So we were talking about potential spending or spending increases. I would note that there's some data that inflation played a very large part in this. Also, inflation is always faster in services and construction. And guess what? That's what the government is pretty much involved in, is services and construction. So you're going to see that. And then we also saw shortfalls in both B&O and lottery tax. So it's a lot of things added up together that get us to this number.
But Ron, would you concede that the state government is bloated?
No.
Okay. Thank you for your candor.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you for your candor.
yeah.
Well, we'll have plenty of time in 2025 as the legislature takes its chair to discuss how they're going to get out of this spending versus taxes. We'll have a new governor. So we will say more. Let's put a pin in the Washington state budget. I want to move to the a terrible event this week that has the union representing King County bus drivers advocating again for barriers to protect drivers from attacks like the one that killed a driver on Tuesday night in Seattle's University District. This is the president of that union, Greg Woodfill.
I've tried to work with the leaders of this area and Metro. I've tried not to get on the media. I don't want to scare people away from public transit. I could beat my chest up here and point fingers and call everybody out, rant and rave. I'm more about let's work together and let's get this solved. We can never have this happen again.
So Woodfill not only called for these barriers that would be much more protective of bus drivers, but also called for more Metro Transit police. This was a stabbing in the U District. The first time a Metro bus driver has been killed on the job in 26 years. I do have a question for you all. First, I'm going to play a little bit of audio from the King County executive, Dow Constantine, who said, quote, "We move hundreds of thousands of people a day with very rarely a serious incident. So transit is, on the whole, a safe way to get around. What happens on the streets can spill over onto transit, and we have to clean up the situation on the streets that involves interventions, mental health, addiction." Finally, Constantine said, "I don't know what the situation was with this person who committed this outrageous act of violence, but we're going to find out."
We are doing everything we can, and we'll continue to ramp up our efforts to make sure that transit is safe for everyone, including especially for the brave operators who are out there on the streets every day.
So, as they say, one incident like this is too many. And it's also true that this happens rarely. So how are we supposed to think about safety on public transit?
Well, I mean, I'm a public transit rider here myself. I mean, I rarely, if ever, get in the car unless I'm on weekend review. But, I still believe transit in Seattle is safe in the sense that most people can use it every day to go to work and come home without ever experiencing violence personally. That's been my experience, right? This tragedy happened at a really odd hour. This was late at night and stuff. This wasn't peak traffic times, right? But there's no denying that there have been just instances of violence, and this is obviously the most tragic we've had. It's even compelled King County Metro to shut down certain stops in problematic, high crime areas. And that's unfortunate too, because transit users in those affected areas remain in a high crime spot, but now they don't have a ride. And it also sets back all kinds of, sort of local government goals in terms of climate, right? Traffic congestion, equity, access to jobs. All of these things sort of center around public transportation. And, I know a lot of people here in Seattle who are longtime Seattleites who I've met since I moved here that just will not get on a bus because they think it's scary and they're afraid. And this is not going to change that.
Yeah, it's tragic on so many levels. I mean, I've been just sick about this. I live just up the street. This is my neighborhood. I ride transit. I was endorsed when I was a candidate by this union. I spent time with these drivers. I have a friend who's a Metro bus driver. Just breaks my heart. And I was reflecting that they did ask about this when I was running. They asked about these barriers. And just to see that didn't get done.
Protective barriers around the bus driver.
Yes, thank you. I've seen that in other cities. It makes me very, very, very sad. And I also think what Dow Constantine said in that clip is right, which is that fundamentally the problem here is a crime and behavioral health problem that is spilling onto buses. It's not about the buses per se. It's certainly going to affect things like ridership if these sorts of things happen. But we can do things about the buses, but until we do things about the behavioral health and the crime issues that are on the streets, I don't think we're going to avoid some level of spillover. I will also agree, as a transit rider, I feel safe. My 12-year-old rides transit on his own. I know which routes and things like that. It's not like I'm not attentive, and there's certainly hours he's not allowed out of the house. But and in fact, actually driving a car comes with a bunch of attendant dangers. But I think you need both real safety and the perception of safety to make transit a real alternate for people. And people are jumpy, and they're very quick to jump back to their cars. And so, we got to fix this problem.
I have a different perspective. I did not appreciate Constantine's remarks. It seemed to me he was saying, okay, well, one person died, but it's very rare and it spills off from the streets. Of course it spills off from the streets. So what? We need to support this union. We need to put up these protective barriers, and we need to have transit police at certain hours on certain routes. And what's the value of a human life? What happens? So it happens again in 5 years, and we shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's too bad, we can't afford it. We need to support these drivers. We need to put protective barriers, and we need to have selected times to transit police, and do it now.
I agree on the barrier front for sure, that it's a very simple fix that's going to add an awful lot of value to protecting the drivers. And, it's also going to prevent another one of these things from happening that is going to set back ridership even further.
Well, I want to ask you about the bus stops being removed. I don't know if you're just talking about just this week, Metro said it's not picking up passengers at some stops in Little Saigon near 12th and Jackson because of safety concerns. Do we know whether that is a tax on riders or drivers or just people waiting for buses at that stop? Does anyone know what was behind that?
I don't know the specifics of how the interface with Metro, but I know there's been an explosion of crime in that area, particularly since there was all the efforts to clear, around 3rd and Pine. It moved. I know the Seattle Times did some extensive reporting on, basically stuff just moving from one hotspot to another, and that being one that's become quite the hotspot. And so I suspect it just got to a certain level where the drivers and riders weren't feeling safe, which is, again, terribly tragic.
Well, I don't think the solution is to reduce bus stops, because you're penalizing the people that need the bus stops the most. So the alternative would be to put police there and transit police in the buses.
Well, we'll have a chance to put that to our new police chief when we meet him, if Sean Barnes is confirmed, approved by the city council. The police, by the way, have named a suspect in this stabbing. They say 53-year-old Richard Sitzlak was a passenger on that bus trip, and he's a suspect, and we'll see. We won't have a show until January, but I think this topic might come up again very soon. I also want to ask about, local governments rely on safe public transit and the perception of safety on public transit when they ask residents to give up their cars. To your point earlier, Ron, the National Institutes of Health says the fatality rate for car occupants is 23 times higher than for bus occupants. But do you think residents perceive buses as safer? And I'm asking you because we're about to get into some local cities in the Puget Sound area starting to drop requirements for parking spots in new buildings.
So, I'll hold on the parking spot thing. I have lots to say about that. But the perception question, I think, while there are people like me who ride the bus and the train who perceive it differently, I think your average member of the public does perceive buses to be more dangerous, just like people tend to be more afraid of planes. There are certain kinds of violence or death that we are inured to, and there are certain kinds that attract our attention. Murder attracts our attention. Car wrecks feel tragic, but just sort of like kind of part of the cost of doing business to a lot of people. And so when you end up with that, 23x, it's clearly much safer to be on a bus. That asymmetry is wild, but whether it's media sensationalism or just the nature of our psyche or whatever it is, I really do think there is a perception problem.
Any other reaction to that?
Just that I think a measure of it, and, maybe even some of my friends who might be listening won't feel good to hear this, but I think some of it is what kind of people you feel comfortable being around.
Yeah.
You're going to be around poor people. You're going to be around unhoused people. You're going to be around, journalists making their way to the office, very unsavory.
God forbid.
In some people's minds. And so I think that, I would just ask people to take a look in a mirror and ask yourself, why am I not riding this bus?
Well, they may say, because I won't be stabbed by someone in crisis when I'm driving my car.
And that
I'll
would
take
be
the risk
legitimate. But if you look in the mirror and you say, I just don't like to be around people who are poorer than me or that reflect, the sort of sad truths about society, then that I can't help you with.
Well, what about, so Ron, tell us about these local cities dropping requirements for parking spots. Are you seeing a tipping away from accommodating cars to, in this case, get more housing?
Yeah, so I just full disclosure, I'm doing some work on this. So with Sightline and with Senator Jessica Bateman statewide. But over the last couple of years, Spokane, Port Townsend, and now Shoreline and Bellingham are stepping toward eliminating parking requirements. Now, the reason they're doing this is because parking requirements is this sort of weird voodoo magic thing that was created really in the 60s, where some people did some very bad studies, came up with some ideas about how many, spots per 1,000 square feet should a restaurant have. And then people just started copy and pasting and adjusting them. And it's created this massive regulations that regulates like butterfly aviaries and, everything, bowling alleys.
Because government gets bloated, is that what you're saying?
No, because the people copied and pasted, right? It's easy. In fact, they were avoiding doing robust work to develop government capacity to figure out what the real needs should be, right? So anyway, they've developed this silly set of rules. I will agree with that, silly set of rules. And one of the problems with it is it's this poison pill for affordability. So it tends to, because a parking spot adds between $5,000 and $60,000 of construction costs, it's fine. Most builders still want to build parking, and they will, and we know that they do. But when you have a regulation that just accidentally jacks that up by 3 or 4 spots, you end up with either housing or childcare or other things where the building is just more expensive than it needs to be, or oftentimes they just don't get built because it's so darn expensive, or because the parking takes up so much space. So just as an interesting component of this, there was a study out of Colorado recently that looked at 3 kinds of housing reform, right, for getting the state to build more housing. One was backyard cottage reform, and that increased, was thought to increase the number of projects that would pencil and get built by about 22%. Upzoning near transit was about 13%. But parking reform, still assuming that builders would build parking, but they would just adapt to actual local demand, it would increase production by 40%, so more than the other 2 combined. So this is really, really getting in the way of us having a lot of the things we want. And so a lot of people do get nervous, right? But what if you don't live in a transit-rich area? What are the alternates? But note the places I mentioned: Spokane, Port Townsend, Shoreline. The large swaths of these cities are not transit-rich. And what you will find is a couple things. One is that if you're building a house and you want to sell it to people, you're going to build parking in most places in the United States, or you'll never sell it. If you're going to be a landlord and you want to let to people, are you going to build zero parking? In a few spots, but in most places, no. And same with commercial, right? But the trick is these copied and pasted from 1962 regulations have gotten so wild and varied, right? They vary by as much as 12x across jurisdictions in the state, that they tend to just way overshoot.
Okay. Saul, is this doing your heart good to hear bipartisan criticism of some regulations?
It really is. It warms my heart.
I know.
And I think Ron is right. And I assume he was surprised to find these 12x. It's unbelievable. But this is endemic. This is just a piece of the permitting problems that we're facing now across the board. And this is one key one.
But I do hear from, in fact, I just heard from a listener saying that, complaining about the congestion that density brings, and that I can't get to where I need to go when I need to go there by bus. I don't have there's no longer a shuttle to get to the light rail station. It could be you're elderly or disabled, you've got kids. There's lots of reasons why public transit doesn't work for everybody. And she says that she's lived here for decades and feels like in her neighborhood, somewhere in South Seattle, I'm not sure where, she just feels like the quality of life has gotten degraded.
Well, there's certainly a nexus to some of the tax giveaways, the payment in lieu of taxes and economic development incentives. This is a very standard feature. If you look at any contract anywhere in the country about, okay, we're going to forgive X percentage or X amount of your taxes you're going to owe to the county or you're going to owe to the city, it's usually for infrastructure improvements like these. So, improvements. But these are the types of requirements that I'm saying could also have a nexus to our budget problems and so many other things. If you look at a parking space, it's so much more than a parking space. It has a nexus to local goals on, access to employment and transportation to it, to the environment, right? And to congestion. I mean, a parking spot is way more than a parking spot right now.
It is worth noting, too, that there's good evidence that excess parking actually induces more driving and
Right.
induces sprawl. So really, in a way,
Brings more cars
right. So
to you.
parking requirements are,
accommodating them.
they're a tax on things we want, like housing and childcare, to pay for things we don't want, like sprawl and climate change.
Let's pause it there, take a short break, and start to steam toward the end of this show, see what else we haven't gotten a chance to mention this week, and what made you smile when we come right back on KUOW's Week in Review. By the way, we're, as always, live streaming the show on YouTube, so we'll wave at you there. We'll be right back. All right, we're almost...
I think it was pretty clear that this particular piece of legislation was on life support once Elon started tweeting, frankly. We heard from Republicans who were whipping votes on this, that they knew that they were hemorrhaging votes every time Elon tweeted.
I'm Michael Barbaro. That's Today on the Daily from the New York Times.
Today at 2 o'clock on KUOW.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books, with stores in Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, and Seward Park, offering a wide selection of holiday gifts for the book lover and new, signed, and rare editions, in-store or online at thirdplacebooks.com. And from the Seattle Art Museum, presenting the exhibition Following Space, now on view, featuring two visions of sculpture by American artists Thaddeus Mosley and Alexander Calder, representing art from all angles. Tickets at seattleartmuseum.org.
You're listening to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. Let's see what we can get in before this show is ended. What else happened this week? We've got hundreds of unionized baristas at Starbucks stores in Seattle and Chicago, LA, walking off the job today, 5-day strike. And they expect this walkout during the eggnog latte season to spread to other cities. Any reaction to that?
Who will get our names wrong on the cups?
Yes. Good question. We're just asking questions.
Just solidarity for me.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. A small town newspaper going away this week. The publisher of the LaConner Weekly News says he's burned out. He says the paper's profitable. He wants $250,000, but he's not getting it so far. There was a nonprofit formed to hopefully meet his price, and they've got pledges worth about $30,000. So Bill Dunbar, the paper's news editor, says it's a newsy community. He likes to think they're chronicling local history.
I'm always thinking that 20 or 30 years from now, maybe some student will be researching the area and they'll rely on our paper as a source.
The Seattle Times reported consolidations led to about a third of all newspapers in small American towns closing over the last 25 years.
Well, this is an issue that our publisher owner, Frank Blethen, has been very active in. You know, he cares a lot about, runs a First Amendment initiative that aims to keep locally owned papers going. And so, you know, it is really sad in the sense that LaConner Weekly News is a decade older than the state of Washington, right? And it's shutting its doors. But it's also a happy story because I'm honestly happy for the publisher and all he's accomplished, and that he built community around this publication and now gets to ride off into the sunset and enjoy life. I'm happy for that. And hopefully this will serve as an example of what newspapers can be to communities in the future. And, you know, it's not a radical idea to think that the current media ownership landscape in this country needs a cleansing fire, really, that will, sort of sprout new growth that is local and invested and wants to thoroughly care about communities and build community there. And, I specifically chose the Seattle Times to come to for that reason. And I just hope that it's not something that's dying permanently in this country.
Well said. State officials want to ban the sale of English ivy. The Ag Department wants to add this invasive species to its list of quarantined plants that you can't sell or transport. They say that hundreds of people have written in support of it and that any economic impact would be small since nurseries that sell ivy can switch to selling other ground covers. Today's going to be one of the busiest days of the holiday travel season at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. 172,000 people supposed to pass through the terminals today, and about the same for tomorrow. The King County prosecutors have filed 34 felony cases against 17 suspected graffiti taggers, said to be part of the biggest crackdown on graffiti vandalism in county history. 17 suspects, more than $100,000 in damages, and the city says graffiti vandalism is up 50% since 2019.
Good for the prosecutors.
So hard. It seems like one of those almost unstoppable crimes. Every time I walk through I won't even say the part of town because I'll jinx it. Someone will say, hey, that's a great point. It's untagged. Every time I walk through an untagged part of town, I think, well, this seems like a matter of time.
I get it, because it is costly. It's a pain in the neck to clean up and stuff. But
yeah,
is it, I'd like to know more about the resources that were devoted to breaking up this graffiti crew. It's not the biggest problem in the city. And so I just would love to hear from a resource allocation standpoint. This is how we did it. We took this many people, this many hours, and what were they letting go to go after, graffiti artists?
And we know
there is a cop shortage, right? Maybe Patrick's saying maybe this is not the optimum enforcement choice.
Right, we have a problem with both behavioral health and violent crime, carjackings, etc. And on particularly the use of felony here just feels like a great way to harden soft criminals into more hardened criminals because of what that does to future job prospects and things like that. So I understand wanting to intervene, but this doesn't seem like a great use of resources or the best way to do so.
Saul, they just don't buy it.
They don't buy it, but I think that the broken windows theory of policing is a good theory, and I think that they just need to also combine it with like Los Angeles is doing, which is clean it up right away. Just clean it up right away.
We right away have to get out of here, so let me ask you, what made you smile this week? Who wants to begin?
I'll begin.
Yes, Saul.
I had dinner last night at a restaurant in Belltown called Tillicum Place Cafe. Doesn't look much from the outside. Inside, it's like a European French bistro, and it was delicious and well priced.
What'd you have?
I had a chicken from a main dish. It was a perfectly piece of chicken. It was great.
Who else is smiling?
The holiday spirits got me, Bill. Kids, holiday concerts at school, and everyone bustling around California Avenue in my neighborhood. And the part that's making me smile the most was seeing people buying books as gifts.
In West Seattle?
Yes, sir.
Right on. How about you, Ron?
Mine is holiday related as well. I am a holiday festivities and kitsch junkie. So my first word was light, and so you can imagine this is my season. I live right near Candy Cane Lane. We had
Ravenna.
Yeah, and we had a sing along at church last night. Just a whole bunch of carols and gospel stuff that was fun. And I'm also a religious person, so there's like a reflective part of this. And I would just say it's climate-wise a dark time of year, and it's also feeling dark for other reasons, just with what's happening on the national level. And it's just been a really, really warm, delightful thing.
Thank you for that. My smile is that the state declared victory in its 5-year fight against the invasive northern giant hornet. This aggressive hornet apparently been eradicated now. Sven Erik Spieshiger with the state said Whatcom County tipsters played a big role.
Every time a hornet was flying around and visiting somebody's window, we seemed to get a call about it. We even got a call about one visiting somebody's doorbell cam. And, that helped direct us to the nests and take them out.
That's hornet surveillance. I don't know if that's problematic, but it worked in the case of the, I'm not going to call a murder hornet. I'm just going to say the eradicated hornet. And that's not a bad way to end 2024. And it's been a great way to end this year talking to all three of you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Ron Davis, political and tech startup consultant, author of the Rendezvous newsletter, right? Is that on Substack?
Yes.
Patrick Malone, investigative reporter, Seattle Times, senior investigative reporter. Thanks for being here.
More gray hairs every day. Thank you, Bill.
Founder and president of Gamoran Legal Consulting, Saul Gamoran. Thank you for coming on again this year.
It was my pleasure.
And mine. Thanks for listening to the show, and our producer, Kevin Kniestedt, and Kathy Faulkner on the radio board, Juan Pablo Chiquiza, Hans Twite. I'm Bill Radke. A lovely end of 2024 to you, and let's get back at it in the new year. See you soon.
Support for KUOW comes from Purpose Dignity Action, working with partners in human services, law enforcement, and local government. PDA designs and implements solutions to help neighborhood public safety challenges.